The black ice of the Don River gave off a low, subterranean groan beneath my chest, a deep shuddering that vibrated straight through the padded cotton of my telegreka jacket and into my ribs. I lay pinned against the frozen riverbed, my cheek pressed into wind-blown snow that smelled of sulfur, diesel smoke, and old frost. Overhead, the sky of Voronezh was slashed apart by white streams of German searchlights sweeping from the western bluffs, probing the open expanse of the river. Whenever a beam swung close, the sheet of ice illuminated like polished marble, exposing every jagged ridge, abandoned sledge, and dark shape crawling across the open ice. Tracer fire crackled through the freezing air, luminous red needles stitching across the darkness, snapping inches above our helmets with sharp, whip-like cracks. I dug the leather toes of my Kirza boots into a seam in the ice, dragging myself forward inch by agonizing inch, my breath puffing out in thick white plumes that froze instantly into ice crystals against my collar. Behind me, straining at the leather harness over my shoulders, came the weight of our PM M1910 Maxim machine gun. Its heavy iron wheels were fitted onto wide wooden skids for the winter snow, but pulling 140 pounds of solid iron across rutted ice felt like hauling an anchor over broken glass. My hands, wrapped in coarse woolen mittens, gripped the harness straps until my forearms throbbed with a dull ache. Instinctively, I reached into the left pocket of my jacket, my thumb finding the cold weight of a heavy iron blacksmith's punch tool. Back in Nizhny Novgorod, in the timber workshop of Master Ignatov, that punch had been my constant tool, forged in white-hot coal to shape hot rivets and bore holes through wagon tires. I carried it now like a talisman, a stubborn piece of raw Russian iron to remind me of the heat of the forge, even as the cold of January 1943 tried to leach every drop of life from my bones. "Keep low, Misha," a rasping voice hissed beside me. It was Private Nikolai Volkov, Kolya, crawling on his belly through the snowdrift, his fingernails digging into the crust. He was clutching a kerosene-soaked rag in his right mitten, frantically shielding the brass water jacket of our Maxim from the drifting snow. His face, illuminated by the glare of a magnesium flare hovering high above, was pale as lard, his nose red beneath the pulled-down flaps of his sheepskin ushanka. Kolya was obsessed with his feet. Every 10 yards, even while crawling under fire, he would flex his toes inside his boots, terrified that the creeping numbness of frostbite was already turning his flesh black. "If the lock freezes now, we are corpses," Kolya muttered, his teeth chattering in a fast rhythm. "The oil is thick as tallow. It's seizing, Misha. I can feel the metal tightening. Hold the harness skids." Sergeant Grigory Morozov growled from 3 yards to our right, his low voice cutting through the hiss of the wind. Morozov was a veteran who had survived the retreat from Kharkov the previous summer, a man whose gray eyes seemed permanently narrowed against the winter glare. As he crawled, his worn brass tea tin, an old scratched container that had belonged to his younger brother who died in the mud of the Donets Basin, tapped softly against the steel scabbard of his bayonet. That faint, metallic click was the only sound of comfort in the terrifying void of the river crossing. "Stop your whining, Volkov, and keep moving toward the bank. If a mortar shell hits this ice, the whole sheet goes, and the river will swallow us whole." We belong to the 1118th Rifle Regiment of the 333rd Rifle Division, part of General Golikov's Voronezh Front. For 3 days, we had marched through the wind-scoured steppes of Voronezh Oblast, battling a ferocious Buran blizzard that drove snow in blinding white sheets across the flats. The temperature had plummeted to 28 degrees below zero, a bitter frost that turned the human body into a brittle cage. The wind blew at 40 kilometers an hour, carving massive snow dunes, zanosi, that buried supply wagons to their axles and swallowed men who fell behind the column. When we finally reached the edge of the dawn, we found a nightmare carved in ice. Previous artillery bombardments had shattered the river's frozen skin, leaving jagged flows and wide cracks that had refrozen into treacherous, razor-sharp ridges. The snow on the ice was no longer white. It was stained a pale, sickening pink in patches where the blood of the first assault waves had seeped into the slush and frozen solid under the moonless sky. With a final heave, Kolya and I pulled the Maxim up the low limestone incline of the western bank, collapsing into a hollow beneath a line of shattered birch trees. The heavy iron gun settled into the snow with a dull thud. My chest heaved, every breath burning like liquid fire in my throat. I pulled off my right mitten to adjust the sling, and my bare thumb accidentally grazed the unpainted steel receiver of the Mosin Nagant rifle slung across my back. The reaction was instantaneous and agonizing. The bare metal in the Arctic bite of dawn bonded to my skin like boiling pitch. I gasped, tearing my hand away, leaving a thin strip of pink flesh sticking to the frozen bolt handle. A sharp pain shot up my arm, followed by a dull, throbbing numbness. I jammed my hand back inside my mitten, sucking on the burned skin, tasting salt and iron. In this country, metal was not an indifferent object. It was a predator, waiting to devour anyone foolish enough to touch it without grease or wool. "Get your spades out," Sergeant Morozov commanded, dropping onto his knees in the deep snow beside us. We dig in here. A half-meter parapet to the front, Maxim angled toward the railway cut. "Move!" We unslung our small entrenching hatchets and spades, turning to the earth. But the soil of the Don Bank was not dirt. It was a solid block of frozen limestone and ice, hard as granite. When I swung my hatchet with all my strength, the steel blade struck the ground with a high-pitched ringing sound that sent shockwaves jarring up my wrists and into my shoulders. The edge merely shaved off a tiny flake of gray frost, leaving a faint white scratch on the ground. We struck again and again, swinging until our lungs bled from the cold air. But after 20 minutes of frantic chopping, we had managed to carve out nothing more than a shallow depression no deeper than a man's hand. None of us huddled in those shallow troughs of snow and ice knew that barely 500 yards ahead, buried deep inside the freezing fog and the limestone ravines of Ostrogozhsk, 4,000 men of the Wehrmacht's 385th Infantry Division and Hungarian regiments were already sitting beside iron stoves in reinforced dugouts, feeding long metallic belts of ammunition into their MG-34 machine guns and waiting for the morning light to catch us in the open. Unable to bite into the frozen earth, we scraped together heavy, packed blocks of snow and crust, piling them in front of our position to form a flimsy parapet. It was an illusion of safety. Snow could stop a wind, but it would shatter like spun glass against a single burst of heavy machine gun fire or the hot fragments of an 81mm mortar shell. Kolya knelt beside the Maxim, his fingers trembling as he worked to keep the weapon alive. In extreme cold, the water in the cooling jacket would freeze solid, expanding until it split the delicate brass cylinder, rendering the gun useless. He unstoppered a tin canteen containing a mixture of snow water and alcohol, pouring it carefully into the filler cap while holding a rag soaked in kerosene over the breech lock to prevent the firing mechanism from binding into a single chunk of ice. "She'll fire, Misha," Kolya whispered, his eyes wide and bloodshot behind his frosted eyelashes. "She has to fire. If she jams when they come down the ravine, we won't last 2 minutes." 2 days later, half of the young men shivering beside me in that shallow shelf of snow would lie frozen solid under 4 feet of drifts, their eyes turned to blue glass and their lips black with frost. But on that first night, we still believed that muscle, endurance, and cold iron could shield a man from what was coming. Around 4 in the morning, the searchlights across the river finally flickered and died, plunging the Don Valley into an oppressive darkness. The temperature dropped even lower, creeping toward 35 below. The wind died to a whisper, leaving a silence so heavy and profound that you could hear the microscopic clicking of ice crystals forming on the wool of your collar. Sergeant Morozov crawled back into our snow hole, reaching inside his heavy telegraphic to pull out a small wrapped bundle. Inside was a brick of hard black rye ration bread, frozen so solid that it resembled a slab of dark oak. Morozov drew his entrenching hatchet and used the back of the blade to chop the bread into jagged, splintered chunks. He handed a piece to Kolya and a piece to me, along with 2 translucent, frozen slices of sallow, salted pork fat. "Eat slowly," Morozov grunted, leaning back against the snow wall, his hand resting on his brass tea tin. "Chew the fat until it melts in your mouth. It's the only heat you'll get before dawn." I placed the sliver of salted fat on my tongue. The salty oil slowly thawed in the warmth of my mouth, spreading a faint, comforting heat down my throat. I sucked on the hard splinter of black bread, letting the bitter rye soften against my palate. Sitting there in the frost of the Don bridgehead, surrounded by cold shadow and damp wool, I reached back into my jacket pocket and squeezed the iron punch. In my mind's eye, I saw the forge in Nizhny Novgorod, the roaring orange embers of the hearth, the rhythmic clinking of my master's hammer, the glowing iron bars that bent and shaped under human will. Iron in the forge was alive, soft, and warm. But here on the Don, the cold had stripped iron of its humanity. Here, metal was cold, hard, and unforgiving, and we were the ones being hammered against the frozen anvil of the earth. We huddled together in the snow, 3 dark shapes bound by fear and iron, watching the gray mist gather over the frozen river, waiting for the dawn that would bring the fire. In the center of our snow trench, resting on wooden runner skates fitted to its heavy Sokolov iron mount, sat our M1910 Maxim heavy machine gun. In this terrible cold, the water inside the brass cooling cylinder would freeze solid within 20 minutes of silence, expanding until it cracked the metal casing like an eggshell. Kolya Volkov crouched beside the weapon, his breath rising in white clouds. He held a rag soaked in kerosene and raw alcohol, methodically wiping down the receiver, the feed block, and the outer seams of the water jacket to prevent frost from locking the firing mechanism. The sharp, biting fumes of kerosene and sulfur mingled with the steam of melted snow, creating a bitter haze inside the dugout. Kolya wiped the internal slides with grease thinned with lamp oil, ensuring the steel belt feeder would not jam when the morning brought the enemy. Kolya's hands were trembling violently, driven not merely by the chill, but by a creeping terror that had consumed his mind for days. He pulled off his stiff leather kirza boots with a wet suction sound and unwrapped his damp wool foot wraps. In the yellow flicker of the birch bark flame, I saw that the skin across his cheekbones had turned a dull, tallow white, the gray-white numbness that marks the onset of frostbite. Kolya stared down at his bare feet with wide, bloodshot eyes, frantically prodding his big toes with his thumb. He felt nothing. "Look at the nail, Misha," Kolya whispered, his voice shaking like dry straw in the wind. "Tell me it is just dirt. If the gangrene takes the toes, the surgeons in the rear will cut them off with a bone saw. They turn black, like burnt firewood, Misha. They rot while you are still breathing." I grabbed his foot instantly, pressing my palm against his frozen sole, and began rubbing the deadened skin with a scrap of coarse burlap. I rubbed until my shoulders throbbed, forcing blood back into the capillaries until Kolya gasped from the agonizing, burning sensation of returning life. At midnight, the shift changed. Sergeant Morozov touched my shoulder with his heavy mitten. It was time for the Slukashi, the advanced listening post, positioned out in no man's land. We wrapped wool scarves tightly around our lower faces until only our eyes remained exposed, racked the bolts of our Mosin Nagants to clear any ice, and crawled out of the dugout into the teeth of the Buran. The wind was a howling wall of white powder, carving high snow dunes across the riverbank and stinging every millimeter of exposed skin. We dragged ourselves on our bellies through a narrow communication ditch scraped into the snowdrifts, staying flat to avoid the sweeping beams of German searchlights on the western ridge. 40 yards from the high triple-strand barbed wire fence of the enemy line, we slid into a shallow listening pit cut into the ice. The earth beneath us was hard as armor plate. We lay side by side in the snow, the relentless cold sinking through our padded trousers, freezing the moisture of our breath into stiff icicles along the sheepskin collar of my shapka ushanka. The silence of the night was vast and oppressive, broken only by the deep, hollow groaning of the Don River ice cracking under the weight of winter. Then, as the wind lulled for a brief second, a strange sensory intrusion drifted across the barbed wire. It was not the smell of cordite or exhaust, but the unmistakable scent of heavy black German pipe tobacco smoke and sour boiled cabbage wafting from their deep-timbered dugouts in the ravine. It struck my nostrils with vivid clarity, a sudden, jarring reminder that 40 yards away in the dark, enemy soldiers were huddled over iron stoves, breathing the same frozen air, waiting for dawn to unleash blood. I pressed my ear against the hard crust of snow. Through the frozen ground, a dull, rhythmic thudding echoed. Step, step, step. It was the sound of German sentries in their thick leather boots, stamping their heels against the icy dirt to keep the frost from killing their toes. Each crunch of boots against frozen snow sounded unnaturally sharp in the frozen night, like dry bones snapping underfoot. They were pacing back and forth along their wooden parapet, unaware that 2 Red Army riflemen lay motionless in the snowdrift beneath them, listening to the very cadence of their agony. At 4 in the morning, the freezing darkness shattered without warning. A dull thump sounded from the German mortar positions, followed by a long, rising hiss. 3 green signal flares arced high into the overcast sky, bursting through the blizzard like burning emerald stars. The sudden, eerie green light illuminated the white wilderness in stark, terrifying clarity. Every mound of snow cast long, jagged black shadows across the icy floor of the Don. Sergeant Morozov and I froze in our pit, pressing our faces flat into the snow, holding our breath, feeling the cold metal of our rifles sticking to our mittens. The flares hovered for 20 seconds, swaying beneath small silk parachutes, painting the snow in the sickly color of oxidized copper, before flickering out and plunging us back into the blinding blackness. When the green light died, the silence returned, heavier and more menacing than before. The pressure along the front was rising, like water behind a cracking timber dam. We knew the quiet was a lie. Across the frozen river, ammunition sleds were being hauled through the storm, and back in our snow-dug nest, the iron Maxim waited, clean of ice, lubricated with kerosene, ready for the slaughter that the dawn would bring. At 400 hours on January 16th, 3 green signal flares cut through the black blizzard over the Don River. The sky did not light up with warmth. It turned the color of a bruised plum, reflecting off 2 miles of untouched white drifts. A sharp wind blew from the east at 30 miles an hour, driving fine needle-like ice into our eyelids. My throat felt like it was lined with rusted wire every time I pulled air into my lungs. Around us, in the narrow assault trench, 200 men of the 1118th Rifle Regiment stood shoulder to shoulder. We wore heavy telogreka jackets and wool caps pulled low, but 30 degrees below zero cut through cotton and wool like a razor blade. Feet, wrapped in layers of dry portyanki, felt like wooden blocks at the end of our legs. Nobody spoke. If you opened your mouth to talk, the moisture on your lips froze instantly, gluing them shut. Sergeant Morozov moved down the trench line, his boots crunching on the frozen dirt. "Keep your heads low until the red light goes up," Morozov said. His voice was a gravelly rasp. He stopped next to Kolya and me, reaching out to check the canvas cover wrapped over the receiver of our Maxim heavy machine gun. The gun sat on its Sokolov wheeled mount, fitted with wooden snow runners for the deep drifts. Kolya crouched beside the trail, rubbing the steel water jacket with a rag soaked in kerosene and winter grease. He was shivering so hard, his teeth sounded like castanets. "The lock is moving smooth, Sergeant," Kolya whispered. "It needs to do more than move," Morozov muttered. "It needs to spit iron the moment we hit the slope." A second later, a cluster of red magnesium stars burst above the German lines on the chalk ridges. "Up!" Morozov roared, his arms swinging toward the riverbank. "Forward for the dawn!" We spilled over the icy parapet in a wave of dark wool and steel. The snow outside the trench was knee-deep, crusted over with a brittle layer of ice that broke under every footstep, plunging us into powdery drifts beneath. Moving felt like wading through wet cement. Within 20 yards, my legs burned with acid, my chest heaving against the canvas belt. Then, the German defense woke up. Across the White Valley, artillery batteries opened fire. Mortar shells tore through the snowdrifts around us. Explosions threw column after column of black earth and pulverized ice into the freezing air. Shockwaves slapped against my chest like heavy planks. Men were thrown sideways into the snow, their dark shapes disappearing beneath fresh white showers. There was no cover. The riverbank was an open sheet of frozen limestone and snowdrifts, exposed to every gun mounted on the railway embankment ahead. Kolya and I dragged the 200-pound Maxim between us. We had thick leather harness straps looped across our shoulders, digging through 3 layers of padded cloth down to the bone. Every 10 paces, the snow runners caught on hidden frozen turf, jerking us backward with force enough to tear a muscle. "Keep dragging, Misha," Kolya screamed above the thunder of the explosions. "Don't let the sled tip." Tracers began skimming over the crust of the snow. Green streams of machine gun fire tore through the blizzard from a bunker on the crest of the chalk ravine. Rounds snapped inches above our helmets, melting narrow white grooves into the snowbank. 10 feet to my left, 2 riflemen were caught in a single burst. They pitched forward into a drift without a sound, blood spreading across the white surface in a hot, steaming pool. We slammed the Maxim down into a shallow snow depression 40 yards from the base of the German embankment. Kolya dropped behind the steel shield, clearing his goggles with the back of his heavy glove. I hauled a wooden ammo box out of the drift, popped the latch, and fed the cloth belt into the feed block. "Lay down suppression on the embrasure," Morozov shouted, dropping into the snow beside us with his Mosin Nagant pressed to his cheek. Kolya grabbed the twin wooden spade grips at the rear of the receiver. He pressed his thumb against the brass trigger bar. There was a hollow thump as the firing pin fell, followed by dead silence. Kolya yanked the heavy charging handle back. It moved half an inch and seized up tight. He pulled again, putting his entire weight into the iron lever, but it refused to budge. "It's jammed," Kolya yelled, panic cracking his voice. "The feed block is locked." I leaned over the receiver cover and looked into the feed slot. Fine, powdery snow silica had blown beneath the canvas cover during our charge across the river. The heat from our previous firing had melted the first layer of snow inside the feed tray, and the 30 below cold had instantly refrozen the moisture into a solid block of ice around the sliding feed pall and the bolt extension. The steel mechanism was welded shut by ice. Across the snowdrift, 3 German soldiers jumped out of a slit trench, scrambling down the slope with stick grenades and a submachine gun. "Clear it, Misha," Morozov barked, firing 3 fast rifle shots to force the advancing figures back into the snow. "Clear it now or we're dead in this hole." Kolya hammered the handle with his mittened fist, but the iron was frozen solid. Forcing it would snap the brass belt feed lever off. My right hand went straight into the side pocket of my Telegreka jacket. My fingers closed around the cold, tapered rod of hardened iron I had carried from home. I ripped my heavy leather mitten off with my teeth. The moment my bare palm touched the bare iron punch tool in the sub-zero air, the skin tore. A sharp, burning pain shot up my wrist as the freezing steel glued itself to my flesh, ripping away a thin strip of skin. I ignored the sting. I jammed the tapered iron tip directly into the narrow gap between the frozen feed pall and the top of the bolt receiver. I grabbed my flat entrenching spade with my left hand and brought the steel edge down hard against the butt of the iron punch tool. A sharp metallic crack echoed through the hollow as the ice inside the feed tray shattered. Fine frost sprayed across my face. Kolya grabbed the handle and pulled back with all his strength. The iron bolt slid home with a heavy clatter, stripping a cartridge from the belt into the chamber. "Fire!" I screamed, pulling my bleeding hand back into my mitten. Kolya squeezed the trigger bar. The Maxim roared to life, its iron frame vibrating violently against the snow runners. A continuous stream of lead tore across the white slope, striking the 3 German soldiers as they crested the drift. They collapsed into the snow like empty coats. The water jacket began to hiss as the internal liquid warmed up, sending a thick plume of steam, smelling of kerosene and melted snow, into the frozen air. Before we could celebrate, a heavy mortar shell landed 10 yards to our left. The world went white and silent. A massive fountain of frozen earth and chalk erupted into the air, throwing me backward into the snow. My ears rang with a high whine. Coughing black grit, I scrambled back toward the gun on my hands and knees. Sergeant Morozov lay on his side in the snow. A jagged piece of mortar casing had torn through his Telegreka jacket at the hip. Dark red blood gushed onto the white ground, vaporizing in the freezing air into reddish mist. His face was gray, skin around his nose turning to candle wax. "Kolya, hold the lip," Morozov gasped, his fingers clutching his scuffed brass tea tin so tightly his knuckles were white. "I've got you, Sergeant," I yelled, dragging Morozov backward under the shelter of a limestone ledge. 2 more German soldiers charged through the smoke with entrenching tools and bayonets to overrun our position. With no time to reload my rifle, I grabbed my entrenching spade and lunged out of the snow pit. I swung the steel edge of the spade with all the force left in my shoulders. The blade bit deep into the heavy wool collar of the first enemy soldier, cutting through coat and bone. We tumbled together into a shallow snow pit, struggling furiously in the freezing drift. Every breath of 30 below air felt like swallowing broken glass, burning my lungs while my arms grew heavy as lead. I brought the spade down a second time, striking until the figure beneath me went limp in the snow. Behind me, Kolya was performing a miracle. Despite a piece of shrapnel embedded in his left shoulder and blood soaking through his boot from a torn calf, Kolya refused to abandon the Maxim. He swiveled the heavy mount single-handedly on its snow runners, laying down a ruthless blanket of suppression fire across the entire ridge. The barrel glowed a dull, angry red against the white snow, but he kept his thumbs locked on the trigger, sweeping the enemy slope and denying them the chance to flank our wounded sergeant. "Get Morozov back," Kolya screamed over the continuous chattering of the machine gun, his eyes wide and bloodshot behind his frosted goggles. "I'll keep the iron talking." I wrapped my arms around Morozov's chest, dragging him backward through deep snow toward the reserve trench. My hands were numb, my torn palm bleeding inside the mitten, but I did not stop until we reached the shelter of the chalk bank. By the time the sun rose as a pale yellow smudge behind the blizzard, the enemy counterattack had failed. The Ostrogozhsk railway embankment was ours, but the white slope was littered with dark shapes that would never move again. Kolya collapsed over the receiver cover of the Maxim, his gloved hands frozen to the spade grips, trembling violently from exhaustion. Sergeant Morozov lay beside him on a stretcher, unconscious, fingers still locked around his brother's brass tea-tin. I sat in the red snow, looking at my right hand. The skin of my palm was ruined, frozen and raw, but the iron punch tool was safe in my pocket. We had held the line on the Don, but as I watched steam rise from the quiet machine gun, I knew the winter had taken something from us that no summer sun would ever give back. The silence following the guns was heavier than the blizzard. When artillery choked into stillness on the morning of January 17th, the air over the Don River felt like frozen glass. The sky hung low and leaden, a pewter sheet pressed against the ridges near Ostrogozhsk. Smoke from burned cordite and sulfur drifted along snowdrifts in thin yellow ribbons, clinging to frozen rills where our mortar pits had been dug 3 nights before. I stood near the crest of the railway embankment, hands shoved into the pockets of my grease-stained Telegreka jacket. The wind had dropped to a razor-sharp whisper, biting through quilted cotton. Around me, the steppe lay paralyzed in gray light. There was no sound of birds or engines, only the dry, glass-like crack of ice snapping free from frosted branches of stunted birch trees. Every chunk of ice hitting crusted snow sounded like a hammer striking an anvil in an empty room. The battle for the bridgehead was over, but the ground looked torn apart by giant iron teeth. Cratering pitted the Don's ice, revealing black water freezing in sub-zero air. Wrecked Sokolov wheel mounts lay half-buried in gray drifts, steel shields scorched by shell fire. Sledges lay scattered across open slopes like broken matches, leather harnesses frozen stiff as bone. Everywhere, painted across the white expanse in brownish-purple smears, was the blood of our regiment. It froze instantly into hard crusts, crackling beneath my kirza boots. We moved across the field, carrying birch branch stretchers and wooden spades that rang like iron against permafrost. The work of clearing the dead was silent. Nobody spoke unless lifting a stretcher or collecting a rifle from a ditch. The dead did not look like men who had fought hours before. The frost had claimed them the moment their hearts stopped, locking limbs into rigid shapes. They lay like carved tallow, faces glazed with white rime, eyes open to the empty sky. Lifted onto birch sleds, they made a dull thud against wood, like oak logs unloaded at a timber yard. I walked toward the advanced Maxim bunker on the lower slope of the embankment, where the heavy gun had fired its last belt during the twilight counterattack. Behind the shattered steel shield, I found Sergeant Grigory Morozov. He was slumped against the frozen brass casing of the gun's water jacket. His sheepskin collar was turned up, and light snow had gathered over his cheeks and eyelashes. His gloved hand was still hooked around the spade grip, as if waiting for another wave of gray coats to emerge from the mist across the railway line. I knelt beside him, knees numb through padded trousers. "Grisha," I whispered, though I knew cold had taken him long before dawn. His face was smooth and white, stripped of the fierce authority he carried through every night in snow-dug shelters. There was no blood on his jacket, only a dark tear near his collar, where a mortar fragment found him in the dark. I reached out with my mitten and closed his eyelids. They felt like hard leather beneath my thumb. I pulled open his telegraphic coat for his papers. Inside his breast pocket, my fingers brushed against cold metal. It was the battered brass tea tin he carried since Kharkov, the tin of his younger brother who died at the river. The brass was scuffed and tarnished by wood smoke, but Grisha kept it polished on his sleeve every evening. I slipped the tin into my pocket, next to the cold iron blacksmith's punch I brought from Nizhny Novgorod. Behind the embankment, near shattered poplars, the battalion set up a dressing station inside a heavy canvas shelter tent. Smoke coiled from a rusted stovepipe, smelling of burning birch, wet wool, and boiled rags. Inside, the air turned your breath into thick mist, carrying the metallic tang of blood, permanganate disinfectant, and singed flesh. Orderlies in blood-spotted aprons worked under kerosene lanterns between straw pallets on frozen dirt. In the far corner of the tent, propped against wooden ammunition crates, I found Nikolai. Kolya trembled violently against the ammunition crate. His face was gray, lips split and bleeding from dry frost. He wore no blanket, only his torn telegraphic draped over his shoulders. His right boot had been slit open by a medic's knife, exposing a foot wrapped in filthy, stiffened foot wraps, smelling of stale sweat and river slush. I sat on the dirt beside him and took his shoulder. "Kolya," I said softly. He turned hollow eyes toward me, looking at his exposed foot as the orderly unwound the gray wool portyanki. "Misha," he rasped through his swollen throat. "Look at my toes." The flesh of his toes was not red or swollen. It had turned dull, waxy yellow near the joints, shading into hard, bluish black at the tips. When the orderly pressed a finger against the big toe, skin did not yield. It was hard as horn, frozen dead by slush in his kurza boots. "They're black, Misha," Kolya whimpered, a single frozen tear glistening on his cheekbone before he wiped it away with his sleeve. "They're going to cut them off. Iron holds if you feed it oil, but skin just rots." "You're alive, Kolya," I said, holding his shoulder with all the strength left in my fingers. "The division moves west tomorrow. You're going back across the Don to the hospital in Voronezh. You're going home." He closed his eyes and leaned his head back against ammo boxes, chest heaving under his coat. He did not speak again. I stayed until the orderly brought hot kipyatuk, then stepped back out into the freezing light. The cold air outside hit my face like a wet towel across open skin. I walked 50 paces from the medical tent, past frozen bodies wrapped in gray tarpaulins, and sat on an overturned supply crate near the bank of the Don. I took Grisha's brass tea tin from my coat. From my pocket, I pulled out my iron blacksmith's punch, the tool steel my father turned in Nizhny Novgorod. Its pointed tip was dark and tempered, notched from years of marking iron plates. I held the brass tin firmly against my knee. With the flat head of my trench knife, I struck the iron punch against the brass lid. The sound was tiny in the vast, empty steppe, but to my ears, it sounded like a hammer beating out a record in stone. Metal shavings peeled away under the iron point, falling into snow like tiny flakes of gold. They had no warmth. They sank into white crust and vanished. Letter by letter, I punched Grisha's name into the brass surface. Grigory Morozov, Don River, 1943. I worked until my fingers went completely stiff, until my hand went completely numb. My skin turned the tallow-gray color of the dead back on the slope, but I did not stop until the last letter was set deep into metal, until brass held his name beyond rust or snow. I tucked the tin deep into my internal breast pocket over my heart, where metal slowly absorbed the faint warmth of my body. Years have passed since that morning on the Don. The war moved west, across the Dnieper and Vistula, until it burnt itself out in Berlin. I came back to Nizhny Novgorod when snow was melting in the spring of '46. My father's foundry workshop still stands near the river, smelling of coal smoke, damp earth, and hot iron scale. The cast iron anvil sits in the center, its black face smooth from decades of hammer blows. Every morning, I stoke the coke forge, pumping leather bellows until coals glow orange, heating iron bars until they spark in the dim shed. Sometimes, when work is heavy and iron comes hot from the fire, I stop and rest my right hand against the face of the anvil, right next to a white-hot ingot fresh from the forge, where heat radiates so fiercely that it singes arm hairs and turns moisture into escaping steam. I press bare fingertips flat against burning metal. I look at my fingers. The skin is scarred and calloused, marked by years of hard labor, but I feel nothing. There is no heat, no sharp sting of a burn. The nerves in my fingertips were killed 50 feet from German wire on frozen banks of the Don in 1943. The frost cut so deep into my hands during those nights in snow that it left them dead to the touch forever. I can touch red-hot iron or river ice, and my hands know no difference between fire and frost. The world moves on. People in the city talk of victory, of parades in Moscow, of great iron machines breaking enemy lines. But when I stand alone, in the quiet of the shop, hammer resting against thigh, I do not hear brass bands or speeches. I hear the dry, glass-like crack of ice falling from birch trees along the Don. I feel the weight of Grisha's brass tin against my chest, and I remember the men whose blood turned the white snow of Voronezh red before gray dawn came. If you carry the memory of those who fell in the silent snows of the Don, subscribe to WW2 Lost Records, leave your tribute in the comments below, and help keep their stories alive.